Hello everybody. Welcome to a little Cobb family history. The activity that takes place on this film took place primarily in Seminole, Florida. Now Seminole is located about 7 miles south of Clearwater and 15 miles northeast of St. Petersburg. The exact location is on Ridge Road. Now, if you were going from Clearwater, you would go south on South Fort Harrison till you come to Bay Drive in Largo. You would notice where Bay Drive is because South Fort Harrison becomes a 2-lane rather than a 4-lane. You take a left there, go 1 block, take a right, and you are on Ridge Road. Now you snake your way down there for about 5 miles, and just past the tennis court is where the Cobb family home was located. Now the people who made this possible were, of course, first my great-grandfather, William Cobb, and his wife, Martha Jane Dickinson Cobb. Now, Martha Jane was born in 1825 and died in 1878. Now, their children, as I have pictured here on the first picture, began left to right, or left, on the left is Thomas Cobb. Then the next one not pictured is Athelia, which was commonly called Dodie Cobb, who later married Archibald Campbell. Next in age was 2 children who died, Charles and Frances. Frances is spelled with an E, so I assume it was a girl. And the next one is Peyton Cobb, who is pictured on the left side, seated in the picture. The next one is William Cobb, who is standing behind and with his wife, Clementine Harriet Hammock Cobb, commonly known as Aunt Pink. Then seated between Uncle Tom and Uncle Pate are Mary Clementine Cobb. Now, most of the information, especially the dates, which I'm able to provide, were furnished from a write-up by Aunt Clemmy. Now, Aunt Clemmy was blind virtually from birth, but she learned to type, she learned to read Braille, she made quilt tops, she taught a Sunday school class for years, and I taught her to play the piano. So she had a lot to do with my life. Okay, now, when we start talking about the actual places, first of all, and people, I want to put in a second picture, which is my grandparents, William Marshall and Clementine Harriet Hammock Cobb. Now, grandfather was born near Butler, Georgia in 1858. At the age of 6, 1864, his family moved to Alabama. We think near Dothan. We also think the reason they left Georgia was they were running ahead of Sherman. Now, I also was told, and I have no documentation, is that my grandfather returned from the war, had a fever, and died. Now, shortly later, I know, not too long after that anyhow, that the family moved to Live Oak, Florida. Now, In 1878, my grandmother died, and my grandfather and his three brothers, or two brothers I believe, the two younger brothers, moved to Seminole, Florida. Now, 3 years later, 3 years later, let's see, in 1878, he and grandmother were married. In 1881, their first daughter, Maddie Elizabeth, was born. She lived to the ripe old age of 80. The next child was James William Cobb, my father. He was born in 1884, died in 1969 at the age of 85. Next was Clementine Harriet Cobb. She was born in 1888 and died in 1986. Then next was Detta, born in 1889 and died at the age of 85. Then Ethel was born in 1890, and she is now going on, she's now 97, going on 110, I think. Anyhow, she is featured later in this film. Then the last son was Charles Ernest. He was born in 1894 and died in about 1971. Okay? Now, the family started out living in a log cabin. And they had a cook shack beside the log cabin, a one-room log cabin. They lived in that from 1878 until 1896, when my grandfather made $647 from his orange crop, and they were able to build the house which is featured here. This house consisted of 5 bedrooms and a living room. The 2 bedrooms upstairs were rather interesting because you can see on this side of the house had stairs going up the middle. So this side's the south side of the house. Those 2 windows upstairs were for the same bedroom. They had 4 other windows on 2 other sides. So these were nice, big, airy bedrooms, 6 windows per bedroom. Now the house was later added to they kept the kitchen, and then 10 years later, 1906, they added a kitchen, dining room, lattice room, and back porch. The lattice room will be explained in later in this tape. Also, somewhat later, they added a porch from the whole south side, that is the tall part, not where it slopes down, and then around to approximately where you can see the porch there on your left. This was a open porch with a banister. It was later enclosed up to the front door, glassed in, but I can't remember when it was glassed in. I should remember, because the first thing I remember about this porch is I was sitting, or my Aunt Clemmy was sitting in a rocker. She loved to rock me. That particular day I didn't want to be rocked, but she insisted, and all of a sudden I became ill, jumped up, ran over, either stuck my head over the railing. I think I was too little. I think I stuck it between the posts. So I remember it was not enclosed then, but it was not too long after that enclosed. Now let's take a look a little bit. I think we got grandfather to Seminole. We didn't get grandmother to Seminole yet. So let's put grandmother in Seminole. Grandmother was born in Jennings, Florida in 1862. At the age of 4 in 1866, the family moves to Lellman, which is north of St. Petersburg. A few years later, they moved to Seminole. Then I think we have gone through the children that they had. I won't try to go on through the great-grandchildren and all that stuff because they were counting, someone counted that there are about 150 descendants just from my mother and father. Now, the things that I want to point out, there are a couple of discrepancies that I really want to point out. One is that when Aunt Ethel, excuse the expression, on the film Come, mentions the way they went from Alabama to Live Oak, where she talks about hitching and so on, tying I guess she calls it. I think that was probably when they left Butler, Georgia and came to Alabama. But I know that there was such a gap between the time they left Alabama and they got to Seminole. I imagine by then probably they went by train. A couple other things that are interesting. She talks about the plentiful food supply. Well, she is right. It makes me hungry just to think about what she said was available to eat. But then from another source, it says, but it took time to do this, and they didn't have time. Frequently, they sat down to a meal of maybe sweet potatoes or guavas and syrup. So even if they did have oysters and scallops and gopher and all these things available, theoretically available, they were not available. Okay, now let's just go on to the tape and see what Aunt Ethel, Mrs. Ziegler, has to say about the day-to-day life of her early childhood.
This is Ridge Road in Largo. Although you still notice a rural air about the landscape out here, houses now flank the road on either side, and traffic makes it nearly impossible to simply stop and look. 100 years ago, there was no traffic here at all, except for an occasional yoke of oxen plodding along with a loaded cart. And if you had stopped to look, all you would have seen was one log cabin and a few outbuildings. The cabin stood right there, just beyond those cabbage palms, peering above the top of the big camphor tree. The cabin contained one huge room and a fireplace so big it occupied almost a whole wall. That cabin and the family of 8 which it sheltered differed little from other dwellings and other families of that day, isolated yet linked by pig trails and circumstances in a wilderness of pine and oak, palmetto and sand, for this was frontier Pinellas Peninsula. Hello, welcome to Pinellas Pass. I'm Mabel Wilcox, volunteer docent at Heritage Park. And this is Ethel Ziegler. She is the last survivor of that family of 8 that lived in the log cabin. Ethel was born right here, December the 29th, 1890. Now, Ethel, this tree is an old friend of yours, isn't it? Can you tell me something about it?
Yes, I was taking care of my mother. Papa had passed away, and I was taking care of my mother and my blind sister. And late one evening, we happened to look, and here come Mother down the street lugging a tree. My husband went to meet her. She was pulling it behind her and pulling down the street, and my husband went to meet her. It happened to be this same old camphor tree.
And when was that?
During World War II. I don't know, what was it? I don't know.
Well, it was in the 40s.
It's whenever it was, anyway. And it has grown that much since then.
But now, where was the log house, the log cabin?
About probably 100 yards direct back there. And then the other one was right in, the main house was right in front of it.
Mm-hmm. The house that you built later was right there.
Papa built later was right in there.
Well,
about 100 yards.
As you can see, Ridge Road has changed a lot. In a few minutes, we'll go to Heritage Park, and then we'll talk some more about the cabin that stood here and Ethel Ziegler's life. Here we are at Heritage Park, where Mrs. Ziegler is going to demonstrate a craft which she learned long ago in that cabin on Ridge Road. But first, let me tell you a few things about Mrs. Ziegler herself. We've spent literally hours together talking in the past month, and I was continually reminded of this quote from Melville: "Youth is immortal. It's only the elderly who grow old." Mrs. Ziegler is 96 and a half. She won't let you forget that half. And she's shooting for 100, but somehow she just hasn't quite gotten elderly yet. She drove her own car for 62 years with just one minor accident. Just 6 years ago, she decided to quit while she was ahead. Now her daughters-in-law and her sons take her wherever she wants to go. But mostly she's content just to keep her own little house, tend her yard, and visit with her friends. In these visits that we had, one of the things that we talked about was how folks like her parents taught their children to use the things around them for their daily needs. They could take the most commonplace plant and do the most extraordinary things with it. Now, nothing could be more commonplace than this palmetto. And here are Jessica and Ethel busily making something out of it. What are you making, Ethel?
I'm making something that even the Indians never thought about when they came here. I'm making a mattress for our bed.
And what do you call that? Palmetto straw?
This is palmetto straw. We store it on. Do it like this. But first, we have to get our palmettos. That has thorns. We have to scrape the thorns down the side.
This is so it won't stick in your hand when you're holding to it.
Yes, they're very. And then we go.
Can you you're getting a close-up of this board with the nails in it? We drove nails in the other side of the board so that the sharp points are sticking up. And this shreds the palmetto until it's very fine. There's another way to do this. We have Jessica over here with a fork. This is an old-fashioned fork, the kind that has the 3 tines. It's made of steel, has a bone handle. These 3-tine steel forks are about the only kind that would be sharp enough to shred palmetto. Jessica is one of our docents here at Heritage Park. If you haven't seen her on TV already, you will be soon, because she just finished doing a tape about the junior docents. Ethel, you had other types of material, didn't you, that were used for beds, although not quite as satisfactory as this? What were some of them?
Well, one of them was, I think the Indians must have used this, because it's been used, I can tell that. Is a fan. But it's used a lot in former days in churches and all this material.
Well, but what, before you do this, let us tell us more about the beds. What kind of materials did they?
Materials for the beds? Well, you could make them out of moss, but moss isn't very fragrant like the palmetto, and it also isn't as healthy because it eludes in for asthma and anything like that. And then you could use the pine straw, but you're liable to get stuck up.
So the palmetto straw was really the best thing. Well, how did you do? You tied it somehow.
But when we get it so fine, as almost as your hair, as you see, and we take it, we wind it around, and tie it in a knot. Then we put it out in the sun for about 2 weeks and let it dry.
Well, now, of course, we didn't, we made some a couple of weeks ago and let it dry, and here we have it already cut. But Jessica will show you, or Jessica can show you.
See how easy after it's cut that it pulls apart, and what a nice curly mattress it makes.
It makes very springy material. You cut that coarse end off, of course, and then unwind it, and it's ready to go into your mattress. We decided not to shoot for a mattress this time. We're just making a pillow. So Jessica is going to stuff this pillow. This is a heavy white linen. It's almost like a homespun. And she'll stuff this, and then it will be ready to use for sleeping. Now, what else could you use the palmetto for?
Well, in those days, you know, we had teeth, but we didn't have any toothbrushes. Or we didn't have any of these fandangled, you know, that you got to reach the back with. So we got a palmetto as a stock. It's soft on the end.
This is the very young palmettos.
It's very palatable, loving. And then we chew it again until we have a brush. But we don't have any paste, or we don't have anything to clean our teeth with, so we'll walk over to a post that has formerly been through a fire, and with an old piece of glass or knife or anything, you will scrape down charcoal, black substance, very much like chalk. And you will get your brush and head for those back teeth.
So you didn't have any excuse for not having
No.
your teeth brushed, did you? Well, there's probably other uses for palmetto that we don't know about, but these have been really surprising. We have all kinds of uses here, fans and everything. How is the pillow coming, Jessica?
It's coming out really good.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back and talk some more about how the pioneers used the things around them for their daily needs. Okay, here we are sitting in our rocking chairs after our labor of making mattresses this morning. So we're going to talk some more now about the old times. Let's go way back to when your father came here from Alabama. Now, we decided that you don't remember, or you don't know exactly what year, but it had to be 100 years ago.
Oh, yeah, 150.
Yeah, it was a long time. Well, how did he come? Tell us how they came
They
here.
call it ride and tie.
Now, what in the world is that?
They had a one-horse wagon and one old horse. And part of them were all of the things that they have that they brought with them was in the wagon, so there was no room for anybody else.
And how many was in the party? How many came?
There was 4 boys. There was 4 or 5, about 6 or 7 of them. So part of them would walk ahead, and the old horse would come slow, a little catch up with him, and then the horse would go ahead, and those that was been riding so far would get in and ride a piece, and then the
Stop
horse
and
would walk, and then
tie
the
the
other would
horse
ride.
and let it rest while they
That was
caught
what
up.
they call ride and tie. They'd tie the horse, and that was in there, was riding. They'd get out and walk, and those behind catch up, and they'd bring the horse up, and pass them, and get out and walk. That's the way they came all the way from Alabama.
So the horse got to stop and be tied to a tree and rest every so often. Otherwise, he couldn't have made it. I've heard a lot about doing that with a horse, just riding a horse.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to know they did it with a wagon, too.
Yeah.
Let's see. Now, this house, he built a log house then on Ridge Road, and
Yes.
he then used an ox cart a lot, didn't he? Like to go to Tampa, he would use an ox cart.
Yes, that's where they got their own commodities. There was nothing around in through here for them at all. But there was 3 stores in Tampa. One of them was a commercial store where the boats came over. Spanish boats came over and brought this stuff along, and Papa would go over ever so often, but it would take him a week along the highway, and he would have to wait until the tide. He had to cross a finger of the water, and he'd have to wait until the tide went out so the oxen could swim to get across, and that was in the vicinity of Oldsmar. So it would take him a week to get there. And then when he came back, he'd have to do the same, wait till the tide went down so he could get home. But that's the way they got what little things that they didn't bring with them that they could use on the farm, to clear up the land and get settled.
And we complain about crossing the bridge going to Tampa. Well, when you were about 10 years old, the log house was kind of outgrown, and your father built another house, didn't he?
Yes. He built all but the dining room and kitchen, but he left the log house while he was building, and for quite a few years afterwards. And then when he tore the log house down, he built the dining room and kitchen, joining the other house, except the breezeway between, which he latticed, which we call the lattice house, where Mother kept her milks, her clabber, and all had cheese and all, cottage cheese. We made our own. They made everything, Mm-hmm. And of course there was no ice anywhere, and they had to put it where it would keep cool.
You didn't get ice very often, did you? Just
No,
now and then.
it lasted about a week because anybody that could get ice and had a place to keep it, and the little old ice plant didn't make it very often in Largo. It's now Largo. Was a little station, a lumber plant there.
And now this was on up after you were.
Yes,
they didn't have an ice
after I
house
was about
in
10
the
years
beginning.
old.
Well, what kind of ice box did you have?
Papa made a box about the size of a coffin, except a little wider. And then he made a smaller box, about a foot smaller than the first box, and lined between the 2 boxes with sawdust from the sawmill in Largo that he would haul in his oxen and his ox cart. And then he made a lid that fit down on the top, and that's the way we kept ice.
Well, you had something to keep your other food in, like bread and things?
Well,
What
that
did you-
lattice room kept the other stuff.
And did you make a safe? Did he make a safe also?
Yeah, he made a safe to keep the milk and the clab and all that stuff in, because you couldn't pile it up like you can a lot of things,
And this was a wooden box with screen on it?
I was with a screen on it. It was when screen had just started coming in. And it was an oddity for to come by and see a safe made with screen, what it was all about.
Now, he used the ox cart for something else. Well, lots of things, but I believe you told me that he used fish for fertilizer.
Well, that was later on. That was when he had his wagon, his horse and wagon.
Oh.
At the Seminole Lake down here, as very few people know, was a finger of the bay. And they dammed it up and made a freshwater lake out of it. But in the wintertime, when Papa was getting his growth started, there was no such thing as fertilizer. So in the wintertime, the fish would come up in that Seminole Lake, or now what it is now Seminole Lake, and feed. And when the tide would go out, they would be left there stranded on the sand and die. So Papa would take his horse and wagon and go down and bring up wagon loads of fish and bury out in through the groves is all they had for fertilizer when he was trying to get his orange groves started.
Well, that was excellent fertilizer for oranges, I imagine.
That and cattle. There was some wild cattle around that would come in and graze in through there.
And you had your own cattle, like your cows, your milk cows and things.
Our own milk cows and hogs, chickens, dogs, most anything you want to talk about.
Everything you ate either grew nearby or in the woods, or you grew it yourself?
Well, no,
Almost.
when you bought but very few things, because in those days there was plenty of things in the woods. There was a wild rabbit, and there was the doves, and the quail, and the turtle, soft-shell turtle, and the gopher, and then there was the fish, and the oysters, and the scallops. So there was no stores any nearer than Tampa, so you didn't have to go very often because sugar and flour was about all you needed with the commodities for the table.
And you also made most of your medicines at home, didn't you?
Yeah, Mama was quite a nurse or a doctor or cure-all, we called her, and all the neighbors called her the same thing.
Well, she was a well-known midwife, too, wasn't she?
Yeah, well, this day and time, that's usually, I guess, what they would call them. But there was a weed that grew out in the woods. We called it the fever grass. And when it was in bloom, it had a little blue flower to it. So Mama would have us go out and dig up these plants and clean the root. She boiled the roots and made a tea. And we had to take a tablespoonful of fever grass tea night and morning to clean out our system.
Well,
a little later on, of course, they began to get the sulfur tablets. But at first, it wasn't any. You just have to use whatever you had and could use.
Well, how did it taste, this fever grass tea?
Very palatable. Wasn't bad at all, thank goodness.
Well, you told me something else that you used for an upset stomach, the cornmeal.
Now, we all loved that. When we had diarrhea and all, Mother'd come down with our old iron kettle skillet. She'd put this regular cornmeal, of course, then it was a coarse, much coarser than what we have today, cornmeal, and put it on the top, on low heat of the old iron stove, because you had to heat it very slowly. And she would stand there and kind of stir it around, until it got to a dark brown, and sprinkle a little salt in it. and put it in a dish, and we would eat it, and it was very palatable. We didn't like that. I mean, we didn't mind that a bit. We liked it.
Didn't know you were eating medicine.
It's a good bit like what we have for popcorn today. It's the taste of it.
And you also use the old cactus, that
The
prickly
cactus, for boils or cuts or any kind of sores, they would clean the top off, cut the whole top off, and with a spoon scratch the inside, which made a gel.
Very much like aloe.
And
Right.
after that, I went on to make a poultice or anything you want, and use that. But for sore eyes, when they sometimes they'd have what they call the pink eye or sty and things like that, she used, believe it or not, banana leaf.
Just how did she do that?
Just tear a piece off of the banana leaf and clean it good, and then just with a piece of cloth, put it next to your eyes and bandage it up with a piece of cloth. And that would draw all this fire and fever out of your eyes.
Well, one thing you used that I don't think I would have liked for boils and that kind of thing, you used axle grease.
Yeah.
That
We
wasn't
didn't
very
any of
pleasant.
us like it, but we used an awful lot of it because in that days and time there were not too many shoes to be worn. And we kids would go without shoes so much of the time. And if the weather was wet, when it was raining, we'd have what they call the ground itch. And that's one main thing. They would tie our feet up with that axle grease and for the ground itch. Mm-hmm. And also use it for boils. Wonderful for boils. It would draw anything to a head.
Well, we could just sit here and talk all day. Ethel and I have had such long conversations, but we're going to have to cut it off now. I think Jessica has finished her pillow, and
shall we take a nap?
I think we will need it, yes. So we'll have to talk again another day.
There's a pillow that we made out of the Hellmiller.
It looks very comfortable.
Hello, my name is Jessica Meyer, and I am a junior docent here at Heritage Park. Now, this little doll, she's really cute with her black skirt and her brown jacket. It would just have a little girl fall in love real easy. If you'd like to see some more old toys, you could visit Heritage Park, and we have a toy exhibit in the museum.
Well, we've been talking a lot about the work that the children and the family did. And now let's talk a little bit about the toys, because they did manage to find some time to play. Ethel, tell us about what did you do for
Well,
play?
the time you have shredded, as we did a while ago, those palmettos, about 250 of them, you realize children didn't have very much time to play.
Took that many to make a mattress?
So it does. So we didn't have very many toys or money to buy toys. And that was it. We would have to even make our own, play with our own. Or I did have one Biss doll in my lifetime with blonde hair. And I was the pride of the country with one doll. Nobody else had them. But the boys, they made slingshots. You know what they are. They fork it with the rubbers and put something in here and pull it and shoot you with it. The boys made that. And then they made the pop gun. It's made out of wild elder. You know what that is, growing out in the woods. And it is in sections, joints. They would cut it just above one joint and just below the next joint until they got it all hollowed out and taken care of. Then, of course, they'd cut the joints off. Then they would make a rod just the size of the hole in that elder. And when china berries was in season, then they would put the china berry in the hole in that elder, and with a rod, a quick jam would shoot the china berry. It would go pop. The boys got a lot of pleasure out of that.
They were a lot of fun.
But there was too much taking care around the barn and all like that for the boys even to have much time to play either.
Well, we were talking about the doll. You didn't, as you said, you had the one doll, and when you didn't have a doll, you used all sorts of things, didn't you?
Well, yes, and I got a spanking for it too.
What was that?
My sister and I, well, we slipped out to Papa's watermelon patch. And we got us a watermelon about so long and about so big around, can you tell?
And what did you do with that?
And we got one Mama's rags and covered its head up, and then we pricked just a little bit so the juice couldn't come out. We made the eyes and the mouth. We never bothered with the nose because we didn't have time. Because she was trying to take it away from me, and I was trying to take it away from her, but that was the kind of dolls we had when we were little.
The baby watermelons.
And we got to fussing over it, and Mama, we tried to make us stop. And you know how kids will be in those days, just like they are today. So she came out and gave us a good big tap, and it settled it. But those good days are gone forever.
Well, you had a lot of fun playing with things like baby kittens and
The most enjoyable, we had kittens, but the most enjoyable thing to play with was our little Berkshire pigs.
oh,
You could get one of those little pigs and lay him down and rub his stomach, and he'd lay there, just as long as you'd rub him. And that was one of our amusements, was rubbing the pigs.
and he would follow you around too.
Oh,
wouldn't
yeah,
he?
just like a dog.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, just like a dog.
Well, what else did you use for toys? And you played hopscotch and that kind of thing,
Yeah,
didn't
we
you?
played hopscotch, we played croquet, we played baseball, we played catch. That's about all.
And hide
all
and
we had.
seek, probably,
All
all the old games.
Yeah.
Well, so it wasn't all work. You managed to find some time to play.
Yeah, Papa wouldn't allow any cards in the house, so we didn't. In the house, we just read what little stories we could get.
And on Sundays, you played very quiet games, right?
On Sundays, Papa wouldn't let us play at all. Sunday was sacred. We couldn't, Mother had to even cook her Sunday's meals on Saturday because the Lord said, 6 days shalt thou labor. And there was no laboring done on Sunday. We ate cold stuff.
Well, that wasn't too bad.
No, we all grew fat over it. Yeah, it was.
Well, those days were very interesting, weren't they? We could just keep on talking about them. We'll have to again get together and talk some more about this.